These soldiers are the most important element in a war. No matter how powerful the armies have, they must have soldiers who are psychologically and physiologically capable of using them. The Russian army made many mistakes in ensuring the psychological and physiological health of its soldiers, especially at the front. Thousands of starving, thirsty, and unable to find clothes Russian soldiers appeared. This internal crisis in the Russian army is growing. According to Western reports, the Russian army lost more than 220,000 soldiers. However, a very interesting situation, as mentioned in the reports, in which it's claimed that more than half of the Russian soldiers were lost due to their poor health and inability to treat the wounded. A deadly epidemic disease has now been added to these stunning situations. Soldiers of the Russian army on the southern fronts are struggling with the epidemic. Now let's examine how the Russian soldiers got a deadly disease on the southern fronts and what happened on the front. The effects of the war in Ukraine continue to oscillate between the eastern and southern axis of the country. Until the spring months, the center of clashes was usually the eastern front lines of Ukraine. But as the weather warmed up, both sides of the war shifted the focus of their attacks towards Ukraine's southern front lines. Russia's main aim in this region was to protect Crimea first and to prevent the Ukrainian advance before it reached the peninsula. The primary goal of the Ukrainian armed forces on the southern front lines was to completely clear the Russians from Kherson and to liberate the Crimean Peninsula. Again, with drone and missile attacks. With the increase in temperature, the Ukrainians began to make the Russians feel much more that they would realize these basic goals. Missiles and gunfire began to reverberate on Ukraine's southern front lines after giving a great shock to the Russian supply lines. The Ukrainians started to focus on the front lines in the southern region again and tried to bring the supply crisis to the contact line where clashes were most common. The Russians tried to respond to this situation by establishing more fortifications, but the Russian troops contracted a deadly disease as they dug up and where animals that died of the epidemic were buried, and all these Russian troops were out of combat. Yes, you heard right. For the first time since the beginning of the war, Russian troops face such a critical situation, one of the worst days for Russian leader Vladimir Putin's army. This disease started in Astaranga. Let's go to Ness-Siorenka, where this incredible event took place. And let's take a look at the before and after the situation here and the causes of the disease. With Ukraine's focus on the southern front lines, the main focus of the clashes was the Russian positions in Ness-Siorenka. If you remember, in the past few weeks, Ukrainians have made remarkable progress around this village, and the Ukrainian forces had weakened the Russian defense there. The main target of the Ukrainian 44 Artillery Brigade was a Russian tank responsible for fortifying a position in the tree belt near Nazarenko. This is not the only position fortified with tanks. In fact, it is quite common practice to fortify open spaces with tanks, but this tactic has both advantages and disadvantages. On the one hand, when you're making a ground attack, it's next to impossible to break through a tank-fortified position because the buried tank protecting this position can quite effectively protect the open land leading to the position. On the other hand, tank emplacements such as fixed fortifications are often easy targets for artillery. UAV operators of the Ukrainian forces have also spotted Russian army trucks with a Russian armored personnel carrier next to them, hidden in the tree belt at Ness-Siorenka. These vehicles were most likely used to transport supply, according to Ukrainian soldiers. They are in constant combat with the mortars of the Russian forces in this region. It didn't take long for the Ukrainians to detect the mortars of the Russian forces in Ness-Siorenka and the ammunition depot on the field. The Ukrainians destroyed 3 tanks, 4 trucks, an armored personnel carrier, and an equipment warehouse in Nazarenko with a coordinated work of UAV and artillery teams. This stunning offensive operation was a huge hit for such a small part of the front line. This indicated that the Ukrainians could soon attempt to expand the bridgeheads here. For this reason, the Russians began to strengthen their defenses by digging new trenches in Nazarenko. But it turned out that one of the areas where the Russians were trying to dig trenches and create a new line of defense was an area where epidemic-stricken farm animals were buried, the Ukrainian mayor of Melitopol reported. As Russian forces build new strongholds, they have contracted anthrax, a deadly disease that requires immediate treatment. Anthrax is a bacterium that can kill people if not treated promptly. As the Russians realized this too late, the entire platoon was quarantined while those showing clear symptoms were sent to Russia. The equipment of the Russians in this area remained untouched, and the special defense area here became a quarantine zone. With the emergence of the disease, the defense areas of the Russians in this region were completely empty because the quarantined Russian soldiers are counting the days to recover rather than fighting or defending. If this Russian contingent infects others with anthrax, such as Russian soldiers or commanders delivering supply, the effects could be enormous. On the other hand, the disease does not need to infect everyone to cause problems. Measures taken to prevent the spread of the disease could weaken the Russian defense because the transportation lines will be restricted. Much less supply may come to the Russian troops in this region. More importantly, it could completely upset the Russian army's preparedness and logistics network in the face of the Ukrainian offensive. Already, the Ukrainian armed forces had put serious pressure on the logistics centers of the Russians. Most recently this week, the Ukrainians had begun to weaken the Russian defenses by disrupting Russian logistics. As a result of the point shooting carried out by the Ukrainian forces for this purpose, the Russians lost 10 oil reserves in Sevastopol, 3 oil tankers in Nizhny Novgorod, and many soldiers and equipment due to precision strikes. The most recent reports of the war showed that both sides were trying to weaken the other side before the main battle began. During this weakening attempt, another critical news came from the southern regions of Ukraine. In response to the attacks of the Ukrainian forces, the Russians carried out a massive missile attack on the southern front lines of Ukraine. A spokesperson for the Ukrainian Air Force announced that the Russians began to use a new tactic to open the Ukrainian air defense. In fact, the Russians had previously sent several waves of UAVs before the missiles and programmed these missiles to change their course while in flight. Thus, the Russian forces were trying to confuse the Ukrainian air defense operators. Fortunately, the Ukrainians have adapted to this situation and have reduced the potential for unexpected maneuvers to zero. For this reason, the Russians had to find a new tactic. Caliber missiles are more accurate than Kh-101 missiles. For this reason, the Russians began to use their missiles with less accuracy to spend the ammunition of the Ukrainian air defense systems, and the Russian forces thus paved the way for the Caliber missiles. After such an attack on Ukraine's southern front lines, Russian forces succeeded in destroying what appeared to be a huge ammunition depot in Pavlograd. Pavlograd is one of the main logistics centers in eastern Ukraine, and the airspace above this city is well protected. Still, the Russians managed to fool the Ukrainian air defense operators with their new tactics, forcing them to focus on the wrong targets. Thanks to this, at least one of the Russian missiles managed to break through the defense and hit its target. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian forces finally started to focus on the front line after attacking the Russian analog centers and indirectly weakening the Russian defensive line. As a result, the Ukrainian army began to directly damage the Russian defense line. In fact, the Ukrainian forces seem to have taken control of the southern front lines. Russia's record losses and Putin's inability to find military resources for his army were among the reasons that undermined the advance of the Russian troops on the southern front lines. As we mentioned to you in the video, we may witness a decrease in the offensive operations of the Russian forces in the coming days with the addition of anthrax and epidemic disease to this plight of the Russian army. The Russians may even become incapable of defending against Ukraine because of this disease and lack of resources. At this point, The duty of the Ukrainian army is to make the finishing strike in this critical time period when the Russian troops set a strategy of an action. In summary, in the coming days, we may receive news of such a big attack from the Ukrainian forces. Everyone can make mistakes, but when people realize that they have made a mistake, they give up their decision. And what happens if they don't admit they made a mistake? They make new mistakes to make up for each mistake and end up in a corner. Russian President Vladimir Putin is also cornered because he keeps making mistakes. The latest news coming out of Russia reveals that Putin is in deep chaos. Every day there are different crises, and the Russian army problems within the army have now escalated, especially the moves made by the Wagner Group. Executives have raised tensions in the Russian army. This situation is also reflected on the Russian people. The last mistake made by the Wagner Group has caused tensions in Russia to rise too much. Putin does not have enough means to end the tension. There could be chaos in Russia at any moment. And what did Wagner Group do? What is the reason for the tension in Russia? How will this tension affect the course of the war? As top news team, we have investigated all these questions for you. It is very important to support independent journalism in order to continue this kind of news. For this, you can use the super thanks button below the video. Let's start if you are ready. The Wagner Group has been one of the most damaging to Putin in recent years. In fact, Wagner was expected to support Putin a lot, but the Wagner Group made many moves that put Putin in a difficult situation. As you know, Russian President Vladimir Putin was a great supporter of the establishment of the Wagner Group. Yevgeny Prigozhin, the leader of the Wagner Group, was one of Putin's most trusted people. Prigozhin was referred to as Putin's chief. But after the Wagner Group gained power, the situation changed. Now, Prigozhin is one of Putin's enemies. One of the most important reasons for the growing tension between Prigozhin and Putin is the illegal activities of the Wagner Group. The soldiers of the Wagner Group commit many war crimes. The soldiers of the Wagner Group do not follow any rules and fight brutally. Their atrocities are often talked about all over the world, especially their execution methods are on the world's agenda. It is not known exactly how many people the Wagner Group has executed so far. However, videos of some of these executions are being shared. In the videos, it is seen that the Wagner Group uses hammers to execute people. This brutal method is one of the most important features of the Wagner Group. On the other hand, the Wagner Group is also known for its illegal business activities. Wagner is alleged to have made illegal profits, especially by trading arms and drugs. Many countries condemn the Wagner Group for these allegations. However, as a result of the Wagner Group's lack of transparency on this issue, many countries reacted to Russia. This has also affected Russia's economy because many countries have imposed economic sanctions against Russia. As a result, the crisis between the Kremlin and the Wagner Group is growing. Nevertheless, the cooperation between Wagner and the Kremlin continued because the Russian army suffered a heavy defeat in Ukraine. Putin knows that he has to use the Wagner Group to win this war. That's why the Kremlin government gives the Wagner Group many special rights. The most interesting of these rights is related to prisons. The Wagner Group is trying to take prisoners from prisons to the battlefield. Talking to the prisoners, the Wagner leaders make them an offer. According to this offer, if the prisoners join the Wagner Group, they will be free when the war is over. Prisoners who would have to live in prison for many years accept this offer and join the Wagner Group. But most of these prisoners die on the battlefield because Wagner leaders assign these prisoners to the most dangerous conflicts. After this was revealed, the number of prisoners who agreed to join the Wagner Group began to decline. No one accepts the offers of the Wagner directors anymore. This made the Wagner managers very angry because the Wagner Group suffered a heavy defeat on the battlefield after many Wagner soldiers die. New soldiers are asked to join the group, but because no new soldiers are joining, the number of soldiers in the Wagner Group is rapidly decreasing. The Wagner faction is in a deep decline. In a report published at the beginning of March, the U.S. security authorities published data on the deaths of soldiers in the Wagner Group. According to this data, more than 9,000 Wagner soldiers were killed in combat in just 1 month. According to experts, this number is increasing every day. The Wagner Group is suffering a historic defeat. To solve this problem, the Wagner Group decided to increase its activities in prisons. A large number of managers were assigned for this. Wagner managers went to Russian prisons and started meeting with prisoners. But something strange happened during these meetings. 500 Russian prisoners were assigned to work at the factory to serve their sentences. 150 of these soldiers were taken to the railroad repair factory in Stakhanov, but the prisoners were met at the factory by soldiers of the Wagner Group. 30 Wagner soldiers asked the prisoners to join the war, but the prisoners refused. Prisoners who refused to join the Wagner Group were ill-treated. These prisoners were removed from the area and taken elsewhere. However, no one knew where the prisoners were taken. The Russian prisoners were very frightened by this and said that they agreed to join the army. Most of these prisoners were sent to the Luhansk region after completing their military training, but that's when the truth came out. One of the Russian prisoners made a phone call to his family before joining the army. In the call, he said, "There are 150 of us here locked in a railroad repair shop. We were stupidly sold. We didn't accept it." Another prisoner said, "We have no other choice. Those who said no have already been taken away. I don't know what happened to them now. These Wagner people came, you see. They don't care now. They are going to kill us and throw us in the field, and that's it." After these phone calls were published by independent news agencies, everyone in Russia was outraged, especially the Russian soldiers. Then Russian soldiers learned that the Wagner Group was forcibly recruiting prisoners into the army. They changed their relations with the Wagner Group leaders. Russian soldiers now have a very harsh attitude towards the leaders of the Wagner Group. This is ruining the reputation of the Wagner Group. The growing tension between the Wagner Group and Russian soldiers worries the Kremlin. British intelligence prepared a report on this issue. According to the report, Russian soldiers may start a revolt against the Wagner Group. It has been known for a long time that Russian soldiers and Wagner executives had disagreements. But if a mutiny breaks out as a result of this incident, the Russian army could suffer a very heavy loss. Putin has asked for special measures to be taken against the risk of mutiny. Putin is very afraid of a mutiny in the Russian army. Putin is living a nightmare. Here the Russians are pushing with the utmost intensity in spite of the poor weather conditions. Due to the bad weather, the ground has turned to mud, so they can use only infantry in order to compensate. The Russians doubled down on using their prisoner reserves, and they also increased their artillery fire because the public scandal between the Wagners and the Ministry of Defense was resolved, and they received supplies of shells. Unfortunately for the Russians, the Ukrainians used this news to launch a series of humorous strikes on all Wagner headquarters and destroyed plenty of ammunition depots. Last time I told you that the Russians breached the last Ukrainian defenses on their way to the main supply road to Bakhmut. I also told you that the Ukrainians blew up the dam in the northern part of the region, which caused a local flood. The freshest reports indicate that the water levels stay high for 2 days and successfully prevented the Russians from immediately assaulting the next positions on the line, giving the Ukrainians the necessary time to regroup. Today, one Ukrainian commander published a video where he described the latest developments around Bakhmut. He said that the most difficult part of the front line remains the northern flank. He said that Wagner forces continued exploiting their prisoners' formations and continuously sent them to assault Ukrainian positions along the whole front line. The situation was described as extremely difficult, and the main factor of difficulty was that the Wagners did not care about losses in prisoner units and just aimed to overwhelm the Ukrainians with numbers. He admitted that this tactic is slowly bringing results because some units managed to slip through the fences or unveil a blind spot which the professional Wagners in the back immediately exploit. This is how the Russians managed to advance closer to Bogdanovka. Nonetheless, Russian sources reported the advancement in this direction is complicated because the Ukrainians are engaging mortars heavily. This is exactly what the Ukrainians lacked in soldier, so it is good to see that they rectify their mistakes and ensured adequate supplies of mortars. This time the Russians experienced the biggest hardships with the westward expansion. Many sources reported a series of Ukrainian counterattacks in this region. Many sources also suggested that the Russians are trying hard to expand their control of the region around Orikho-Vasilivka. It looks like the efforts of both sides resulted in a series of head-on collisions, which led to no changes to the front line. The Ukrainians have also conducted a counterattack in the southern part of Bakhmut, this time not in the forest near Jasper, but the one to the south of Bakhmut. Russian sources confirmed that there was an attempt to move towards Kievska. The main goal here was to push the Russians from the small residential area and keep the Russians purely in the forest. And it looks like this counterattack was successful. As you might have noticed, all heavy clashes are taking place outside the city. This directly implies that the Ukrainians have almost all forces outside the cauldron. In fact, the estimates of the Russian military-affiliated analysts have been greatly corrected, and now the Russians say that there are only around 30,000 Ukrainians left inside their town, and the best that they can hope for is to capture 500 troops. This is a 40-fold step down from the previous assessment of 20,000. The decreased concentration of troops is also indicated by sudden Russian advances on the eastern bank of Bakhmut. Last time I told you that the Russians captured one of the two high-rise building blocks, and today they captured the second. Their control around the meat processing plant has also increased, so hopefully the next few days the Ukrainians will leave the side of the river completely. A few days ago, the head of the Wagner forces, Prigozhin, announced that their feud with the Ministry of Defense was over because they had finally fulfilled the request and sent the Wagners all the necessary ammunition. The Ukrainians did not miss a chance and launched an extensive series of fire missions on the main supply hubs of Wagner forces. Today, explosions were reported in Kadayevka and Stakhanov in Kadayevka. The locals reported huge explosions and secondary detonations, clearly indicating that the Ukrainians had destroyed an ammunition depot. And in Stakhanov, the locals reported a series of strikes which resulted in the destruction of at least one ammunition depot and also a railway car factory shop, which the Wagners reportedly turned into a warehouse with equipment. Overall, the situation in Bakhmut is extremely difficult. The Russians continue to successfully exploit their operational reserves to overwhelm the Ukrainians, and they got very close to the supply lines, which forced the Ukrainians to move in and out of the city only at night. But from good news, the Ukrainians have withdrawn almost all forces from Bakhmut and concentrated them where they needed the most on the flanks. The rains complicated Russian advances through the fields and forced them to use pure infantry. And the Ukrainians have successfully destroyed several ammunition depots in the cities that are considered to be Wagner headquarters, which should also decrease the frequency of their use of artillery support.